September 13th, 1598. In the austere confines of El Escorial, a king lay dying, consumed by an ailment that defied the age's remedies, utterly powerless in the very palace designed to manifest his absolute dominion. Philip II, once the monarch of the largest empire the world had ever seen, commanding vast fleets and armies, overseeing an inquisition that struck terror into the hearts of millions, found himself reduced to a grotesque spectacle of human vulnerability. His suffering had endured for 53 days, a relentless torment that stripped him of every vestige of his once formidable presence, leaving only a skeletal frame racked by unspeakable pain. The air in his chamber, thick with the cloying scent of putrefaction and ineffective poultices, was a tangible witness to his agonizing decline, a stark counterpoint to the sacred grandeur of the monastery palace that had been his life's ultimate project. His legs, grotesquely swollen and festering, were infested with maggots, a horrifying living testament to the physical decay that consumed him from within, mocking the very concept of regal inviolability. This was no ordinary deathbed vigil. It was a macabre exhibition of a king devoured by the fragility of his own mortality, the ultimate irony for a ruler who had relentlessly pursued absolute control over every facet of his realm and his own destiny. The final 24 hours of Philip II were not merely the ending of a life, but the agonizing unraveling of an epoch, a moment when the illusion of boundless power clashed devastatingly with the brutal, undeniable reality of human flesh. His court, once awestruck by his meticulous authority, now stood by, haunted, witnessing the raw, unadorned horror of their sovereign's final, undignified moments. This private anguish, endured in the presence of his son and a few trusted confessors, began to transform a man defined by rigid piety and imperial ambition into a symbol of universal suffering. The physical ordeal Philip endured transcended mere illness. It became a public spectacle of royal decay, a profound and disturbing paradox within the very heart of his meticulously constructed empire. His doctors, the most learned physicians in Christendom, were utterly baffled, their remedies proving worse than useless, serving only to highlight the devastating impotence of human knowledge in the face of nature's relentless progression. Gout, fever, and what later developed into gangrenous ulcers on his knees and legs became the instruments of his humiliation, consuming his flesh with a deliberate brutality that left no room for the customary dignity of kings. The very sheets on his bed, once pristine, became saturated with the putrid discharge of his wounds, requiring constant changing, a task that fell to the highest noblemen, forcing them to confront the stark reality of their monarch's utter decomposition. Maggots, swarming amidst the decay, were not merely a symptom of neglect, but a vivid, horrifying metaphor for the vulnerabilities that even the most formidable power could not repel. They were the ultimate, undeniable proof of a king stripped bare, his earthly grandeur dissolving into organic matter. This gruesome intimacy of suffering became a crucible, burning away the layers of imperial might and revealing the raw vulnerability beneath, challenging the divine right of kings with the undeniable laws of biology. His cries of pain, though muffled by the thick walls of El Escorial, echoed the collective agony of an empire strained by endless wars and religious fervor, a mirror to the suffering he had, perhaps inadvertently, inflicted upon millions throughout his reign. This gradual disintegration, witnessed by his closest confidants, etched itself into the collective memory, not as a glorious end, but as a slow, agonizing descent into utter helplessness. The once unshakable ruler, who governed a vast portion of the globe with unwavering conviction, was now a prisoner of his own failing body, his magnificent will finally broken by the insidious advance of a physical torment that left no room for escape, no respite from its relentless, humiliating assault. To understand why Philip II's final moments carried such profound symbolic weight, we must remember the man he was, forged in the crucible of absolute power and rigid piety. Born in Valladolid in 1527, the sole legitimate son of Emperor Charles V and Isabella of Portugal, Philip was destined for a life unlike any other, inheriting the most expansive and tumultuous empire the world had ever seen. His upbringing was one of relentless discipline, intellectual rigor, and an unwavering immersion in Catholic dogma. From an early age, he was schooled in statecraft, tutored by the finest minds, and burdened by the immense expectations of his imperial father, who often described Philip's methodical temperament as suited to the burdens of governance. Unlike his peripatetic father, who traversed Europe and North Africa, Philip was rooted, meticulous, and deeply pious, traits that would define his nearly 50-year reign. He was a silent, unsmiling man, given to long hours of solitary work, a stark contrast to the boisterous and expansive courts of other European monarchs. The death of his mother when he was 12, followed by the premature deaths of his first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, and then his young son, Don Carlos, hardened his resolve and deepened his already fervent devotion, imbuing him with a sense of divine purpose, almost a personal mandate from God to defend Catholicism. His life had never truly been his own, but rather a meticulously choreographed performance of duty and faith, where personal desires were sublimated to the perceived needs of the crown and the church. This early formation, steeped in the grandeur of the Habsburg court yet shadowed by personal loss and profound religious conviction, laid the groundwork for a monarch who would rule with an iron will, convinced of his righteous path, oblivious to the immense human cost his unwavering beliefs would ultimately exact. He was a prince-made king, but never truly allowed the emotional breadth of a private individual. Upon his father Charles V's unprecedented abdication in 1556, Philip II inherited an empire of astonishing scale and complexity, a vast mosaic of territories that stretched from Spain across Italy, the Netherlands, and vast swathes of the Americas. His accession marked a deliberate shift in governance. Unlike his father's sprawling, itinerant court, Philip chose to centralize power within Spain, making Madrid the capital and building El Escorial not just as a palace, but as a spiritual, administrative, and mortuary hub for his dynasty. This was the era of detailed decrees, meticulously catalogued documents, and a bureaucracy that, while cumbersome, allowed the king to exert an unprecedented level of control. He envisioned a global Catholic monarchy, unified under his unwavering faith, and pursued this vision with relentless zeal. His early reign was marked by crucial military victories, notably at St. Quentin, solidifying Spanish dominance in Europe. He solidified alliances through dynastic marriages, most famously with Mary I of England, briefly uniting the two crowns in a shared Catholic cause, even though that union bore no heir and ended with Mary's early death. Philip, ever the administrator, was known for working long hours, poring over dispatches, making marginal notes on every document, striving for absolute knowledge and control over his far-flung dominions. This meticulousness, while admirable in its dedication, also bred an inherent slowness and an inability to delegate effectively, bottlenecks that would later plague his administration. He was not a charismatic warrior king like his father, but a quiet, diligent bureaucrat, whose power emanated not from the battlefield, but from the meticulously organized stacks of paper on his desk. His authority derived from the sheer volume of information he processed and the absolute finality of his decrees. This foundational period of his reign was about consolidation, the painstaking work of weaving together disparate lands and peoples into a coherent, formidable whole, under the undisputed authority of God's chosen monarch. The zenith of Philip II's power was simultaneously the crucible of his most profound moral challenges, a period marked by an unyielding pursuit of religious uniformity that often manifested in devastating cruelty. He saw himself as the sword of Catholicism, divinely appointed to defend the Church against the rising tide of Protestantism and the persistent threat of Ottoman expansion. This conviction fueled his relentless wars against the Ottoman Empire, culminating in the naval victory at Lepanto, against the Protestant Netherlands, a brutal and protracted conflict that would drain Spanish resources for decades, and ultimately, against England, epitomized by the catastrophic failure of the Spanish Armada in 1588. His religious zeal found its most chilling expression in the Spanish Inquisition, which, under his reign, was transformed into an even more potent instrument of social and spiritual control. Thousands were interrogated, tortured, and executed for heresy, apostasy, or blasphemy, creating a pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion. The auto da fe, the public ceremony of condemnation and punishment, became a chilling demonstration of state power intertwined with religious fanaticism, designed to instill terror and enforce conformity. This was not merely the enforcement of legal statutes. It was a deeply ingrained belief in the righteousness of his cause, a conviction that allowed for the systematic suppression of any deviation from the official creed, regardless of the human cost. The expulsion of the Moriscos, the descendants of Spain's Muslim population, years after their forced conversion, served as another stark example of this uncompromising vision, disrupting lives and contributing to economic decline. The vast wealth pouring in from the Americas, the silver and gold from Potosi, fueled these campaigns, yet paradoxically also contributed to inflation and economic instability within Spain itself. It was an era of immense artistic and literary flourishing, the Spanish Golden Age, but beneath the surface of cultural brilliance lay a kingdom haunted by the very mechanisms of its own oppressive power. Yet something went wrong. The colossal ambition and relentless pursuit of a global Catholic empire extracted a devastating and unsustainable toll, both on the Spanish state and on Philip II personally. The endless wars in the Netherlands against France, against England, and the constant vigilance against the Ottoman Turks bled the royal treasury dry, leading to multiple declarations of bankruptcy despite the immense influx of silver from the New World. This economic strain translated into widespread poverty and social unrest within Spain, as the very people who were meant to benefit from imperial grandeur found themselves burdened by ever-increasing taxes and dwindling opportunities. The glorious victories were often overshadowed by equally devastating defeats, most notably the ignominious failure of the Armada, which shattered the myth of Spanish naval invincibility and marked a turning point in European power dynamics. But the costs were not merely financial or geopolitical. They were deeply personal for the king himself. Philip II outlived 4 wives and numerous children, including his beloved heir, Don Carlos, whose early death, shrouded in mystery and speculation, was a profound personal tragedy that deepened the king's inherent melancholy and isolation. The death of his 4th wife, Anna of Austria, left him with only his sickly young son, Philip III, as his designated successor. Each loss compounded his sense of duty, yet also intensified his retreat into the solemn confines of El Escorial. The weight of ruling such an expansive and troubled empire, combined with chronic physical ailments and successive personal tragedies, gradually transformed the meticulous monarch into a reclusive, increasingly frail figure. The sheer volume of human suffering that his policies, however well-intentioned from his perspective, had wrought across his dominions began to manifest, not as direct karmic retribution, but as a slow, insidious erosion of the king's own vitality. He was a man utterly alone at the pinnacle of power, bearing the crushing burden of an empire that was slowly but surely exhausting itself. As the 16th century drew to a close, Philip II's reign entered its twilight, marked by a palpable sense of decline that permeated both the king's physical being and the state of his once unassailable empire. The grand, austere monastery palace of El Escorial, which had been the pulsating heart of his administration and the spiritual anchor of his rule, now became a symbol of his increasing isolation and the looming shadows over his dynasty. He rarely left its confines, retreating further into the meticulously ordered routines of prayer, paperwork, and contemplation. The vast cold corridors and the echoing silence of its cloisters mirrored the growing detachment of the monarch from the vibrant, often chaotic reality of his far-flung domains. His life had never truly been his own, dictated by the relentless demands of a divine mission. But in these final years, this self-imposed servitude deepened into a profound physical and emotional confinement. He was no longer the active, decisive ruler who had once personally overseen every detail of his sprawling bureaucracy. Instead, his governance became increasingly reliant on written reports and the distant authority of his decrees. The wars continued, particularly in the Netherlands, but their objectives seemed ever more elusive, their costs ever more ruinous. His formidable will, though still present, was increasingly tempered by the relentless advance of age and chronic illness. The physical aches that had plagued him for decades, primarily severe gout, intensified, making movement excruciatingly painful. The relentless pressure of his imperial duties, combined with the profound personal losses he had endured, wore him down, transforming the once formidable figure into a gaunt, stooped man. He began spending more time in contemplation, preparing for his end, turning his thoughts increasingly towards the afterlife, seeking solace in the relics he had painstakingly collected and housed within El Escorial. The empire, much like its king, was showing signs of exhaustion, its formidable strength strained by generations of relentless ambition, and its once vibrant energy slowly dissipating into an air of weary resignation. The nature of Philip II's final illness, a particularly gruesome and protracted demise, served as a chilling, tangible manifestation of the decay that had subtly consumed his empire for years. It was not a sudden, merciful end, but a slow, agonizing disintegration, a physical torment that meticulously stripped away every shred of dignity from the once absolute monarch. For 53 days, the king suffered from an agonizing combination of gout, fever, and most horrifyingly, open sores and abscesses that formed on his joints, particularly his knees and elbows. These wounds festered, refusing to heal, becoming breeding grounds for a pervasive infestation of lice and maggots. His attendants and the highest members of his court were forced to perform the most undignified tasks, constantly changing the putrid dressings, battling the relentless swarm of insects that consumed his decaying flesh, and enduring the overwhelming stench of gangrene that clung to the royal chambers. The very air was thick with the odor of death, an inescapable reminder of the fragility of even the most exalted human body. This physical collapse was profoundly symbolic. The empire Philip had so painstakingly built, maintained by an inflexible will and rigid piety, was now showing signs of its own decay, strained by perpetual war, economic exhaustion, and a bureaucracy often paralyzed by its own meticulousness. The internal rot of his body mirrored the deep-seated problems gnawing at the foundations of his vast dominion. The magnificent, imposing architecture of El Escorial, designed to embody order and eternal power, now inadvertently framed a scene of horrific, visceral chaos, highlighting the ultimate impotence of human grandeur in the face of biological inevitability. His personal agony became a microcosm of the systemic failures that had begun to plague his reign, a haunting demonstration that even the most powerful men are ultimately subject to the brutal laws of nature, their absolute authority rendered utterly meaningless in the face of their own mortality. The final days of Philip II were a testament to the ultimate indignity of the human condition, a stark reminder that even the most powerful monarch could not escape the brutal, humbling reality of physical decay. Confined to his bed, his body a map of festering wounds and insufferable pain, the king was stripped of every pretense of his former majesty. His voice, once capable of commanding vast armies and shaping the destiny of nations, was reduced to a pained whisper. The constant presence of maggots consuming his flesh became a grotesque symbol of his total loss of control, a visible affront to the very concept of regal inviolability. Despite the horrifying circumstances, Philip faced his end with an unwavering piety that had defined his life. He received the last rites multiple times, clung to sacred relics, and had the true cross brought to his bedside, attempting to find solace in the spiritual, even as his physical being disintegrated around him. His son, the future Philip III, and his daughter Isabella Clara Eugenia, remained constantly at his side, witnessing the agonizing final moments of a man who had once been the axis of their world. This intimate witness to his suffering created a profound sense of sympathy among those few allowed into the chamber, a raw glimpse into the vulnerability that transcended his royal status. Yet, this shared experience of human frailty was also tinged with the profound discomfort of those who understood the immense historical weight of the man before them. He endured the agony with a stoic resolve, a final, painful act of what he believed was divine submission, transforming his personal suffering into a last, agonizing sacrifice for his faith. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the king's labored breathing and the quiet movements of the attendants, a shared knowledge that they were observing not just a death, but the end of an era, played out in the most horrifying and visceral terms imaginable. As the sun rose on September 13th, 1598, casting long shadows across the granite walls of El Escorial, the final moments of Philip II arrived. The king, who had endured 53 days of unspeakable physical torment, now lay at the precipice of his earthly existence. His breathing became shallow, his pulse faint, yet his eyes remained fixed on the crucifix clutched tightly in his emaciated hand, a final act of unyielding devotion. The chamber, once filled with the hushed activity of attendants battling the pervasive infestation, now fell into an even deeper silence, pregnant with the gravity of the impending moment. The Archbishop of Toledo administered the last sacrament, the anointing of the sick, a sacred ritual contrasting starkly with the raw, undignified reality of the king's dying body. Philip II, the most powerful man in the Christian world, whose pronouncements had shaped continents and sparked wars, was now reduced to a simple, suffering human being, his regal power utterly dissolved in the face of death's relentless advance. The attendants, the priests, and his devoted children knelt around the bed, their faces etched with a mixture of reverence, sorrow, and perhaps a quiet relief for the man whose suffering was about to end. The profound silence was broken only by a final, rattling breath, then stillness. The moment of death was not one of triumph or grandeur, but of quiet, almost humble surrender. A final, brutal testament to the universal equality of mortality. The king was dead. His long, complex, and often brutal reign had reached its earthly conclusion, leaving behind not only an immense empire, but also a haunting question about the true nature of power and the limits of human control. The air in the chamber, once heavy with the stench of decay, now seemed to hold the lingering echo of a life defined by unwavering conviction and profound, agonizing sacrifice. The death of Philip II, far from offering narrative closure, instead delivers a profound, sobering insight into the true nature of power, faith, and human vulnerability. His excruciating end at El Escorial, devoured by insects within the very sanctuary he had painstakingly built, stands as a haunting testament to the ultimate impotence of earthly authority in the face of biological decay. It was not justice, it was a warning, etched in the gruesome details of a king's demise, against the hubris of absolute control and the illusion of human invincibility. For nearly 50 years, Philip had striven to mold the world to his unyielding vision, believing firmly in his divine mandate to defend Catholicism and expand his vast empire. He pursued this goal with relentless diligence, unwavering conviction, and, at times, devastating brutality, shaping an era defined by religious wars, the Inquisition, and monumental expenditures of both wealth and human life. Yet, in his final moments, all his power, all his piety, all his accumulated wealth and influence could not grant him a moment's respite from the physical torment that consumed him. This stark contrast forces us to reflect on the very foundations of sovereignty, urging us to question the systems that allow such immense power to be concentrated in a single individual, often at the great cost of human suffering. The failure of those systems to protect even the monarch from his own agonizing decay highlights a fundamental truth, that even the most formidable reigns are ultimately ephemeral, subject to the same biological laws that govern every living creature. Philip II's legacy is not merely one of empire and religious fervor, but a chilling narrative about the fragility of power and the relentless, universal march of mortality. His life, marked by unwavering duty and profound personal loss, reached an end that was both deeply personal and universally resonant, compelling us to remember the limits of human dominion and the enduring, humbling power of the human condition. His reign left a lasting imprint on Europe and beyond, shaping the course of history through his zealous pursuit of religious unity and imperial expansion. Yet the price of this immense ambition was profound, leading to economic strain, perpetual warfare, and internal dissent that would haunt Spain for centuries. The Spanish Golden Age, while flourishing culturally under his patronage, was simultaneously overshadowed by the grim realities of the Inquisition and the constant shadow of religious conformity. Philip II was a man of paradoxes, deeply pious, yet capable of immense cruelty. A meticulous administrator yet prone to crippling indecision. A devoted father yet distant and isolated by the demands of his throne. His enduring image remains that of the prudent king, a monarch whose unwavering commitment to his faith and his empire was absolute, yet whose policies often led to unintended and devastating consequences. The collective memory of his rule is not a simple narrative of good versus evil, but a complex tapestry of profound conviction, political maneuvering, and the immense human cost of ideological warfare. We must remember that the systems meant to protect them, the church, the state, had in his context often become their executioner, bending human lives to the will of an overarching, inflexible dogma. This historical reflection serves as a continuous ethical warning, urging contemporary society to examine the implications of unchecked power, the dangers of ideological purity, and the enduring human suffering that can arise when rigid beliefs override empathy and practical wisdom. The torment Philip endured in his final days was a private tragedy, yet it resonates with the collective torment of his reign, a poignant, unforgettable conclusion to a life lived entirely for a cause that, in the end, consumed him utterly. The story of Philip II, consumed by insects in his final hours, remains a haunting reminder of the brutal, undeniable truth that all power, however vast, eventually succumbs to the inevitable march of time and the humbling reality of human mortality. This is his immortality,